Welcome to the First Presbyterian Church of Englewood, a community committed to live boldly, share boundlessly, grow community, and build God's world. Please visit us in person or at englewoodpres.org.
Well, friends, our gospel lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 17, verses 5 through 10. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." The Lord replied, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you. Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron, and serve me while I eat and drink? Later you may eat and drink'? Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.'" Well, we are in week 4, the final week of this series we've been preaching called How to Be Happy. And so as we are in this final week, just wanted to give you a quick review that what we were talking about was the first week we were talking about attitude. We're talking about having a positive attitude when we see things in the world that appear to be unfair. And rather than thinking about that unfairness and seeing it as something that is working against us. The unfairness I'm talking about is not injustice, but the unfairness of seeing unmerited blessing, unmerited favor come on people, and then sometimes we can look at that with a certain envy, a certain jealousy, and not to do that, but rather to help us understand that the world is full of unmerited favor, and we are the recipients of unmerited favor from God. Then in the second week, we talked about relationships and talked about how building relationships is so critical to our future, that it's the number one resource we can have for our lives is the relationships that we foster. And then last week we were talking about having a vision for your life and having a vision and working backwards from that vision step by step, saying, okay, if I have this vision for my life, what do I need to achieve that vision? And just working backwards step by step. If I don't have what I immediately need to achieve that, what would I get to that next part, and go keep working backwards until you get down to a point where you can achieve the next steps that would get you moving toward a vision that you've created for your life. By the way, all these messages are online. They're on our website, and they're also on our YouTube channel, so we encourage you to check those out or pass them on to a friend if you think that they would be helpful. And this week, we're going to be talking about what that vision ought to be, that if you think about the vision for your life that you would be aiming your life toward, what would that actually look like? Because a lot of times when people talk about what they hope for, what they want out of life, I hear people often just minimize it. I hear people talk about that and make it small. It begins with, well, all I want, and that sounds good, it sounds modest, but sometimes I think we're actually selling ourselves short when we do that, okay? Because the question I want to start with is asking, is your vision for your life worthy of your life? At the end of the day, is the vision that you have, this thing that you're working toward, going to be worthy of having spent your life working toward it? For example, I'm a Cubs fan, all right? I mentioned that a lot. I grew up in Chicago, love the Cubs, and so, as George Will, the columnist, said, Cubs fans are 90% scar tissue because we have lived through so much disappointment, and then finally, in 2016, after 108 years, they won the World Series, okay? I used to love those T-shirts that said, "Chicago Cubs, any team can have a bad century." And so Cubs fans all over the country were saying, "Now I can die in peace." But, that's a joke, that's funny. But really, that question is kind of interesting, is what would let you do that? What would let you get to the end of your life and say, with all I've done, with all we've been able to do, with everything that we've put together, I can die in peace? What would make you say that? Now, one of the stories I want to talk about in terms of vision is a story that has to have a bit of a disclaimer. It's a story that I tell reasonably often because it has impacted the church so much, and it was the story of the founding of Willow Creek Community Church outside of Chicago, which became a new kind of church. Now, the disclaimer I have to add, which I think there's a lesson in, is that the founding pastor, after 40-some years, had announced his retirement, and then what came to light was a number of allegations of harassment that had taken place in his tenure. And they were well-founded, apparently. And so what happened was, last year there was a huge upheaval in that church as a result. Their founder, who had founded them over 40 years ago, was retiring, and they had already named a succession plan of 2 pastors who would take over, one of whom would be the primary preacher, and the other was going to be the executive pastor, the person who runs all the administration. And that was going to be a woman, and so she was going to be one of the most prominent female pastors in the country, because you would have a female executive pastor of one of the largest churches in the country, a groundbreaking church, which had changed everything. And then when these allegations surfaced, it became known that a few years before, some women had brought the allegations forward, and the board and the pastors had kind of believed him. He said there's nothing to it, they're false, and they believed him rather than the women. And then the board and the pastors did something that I thought was courageous and right and good. They resigned en masse. After these allegations were demonstrated, they said, we have lost the moral credibility to lead this church forward, because the women came to us, we did not listen to them, and it turned out they were right. And so they resigned en masse. The board said, legally, we can't all resign at once because you have to have a board, but we are committed that over the next 12 months, the 1/3 of us are resigning immediately. As soon as you elect and replace that third, another third will resign. And as soon as you elect and replace that third, the last third will resign. And within a matter of months, the entire board will be turned over. Both of those pastors who were going to succeed him resigned. And so I need to say that, because if I want to hold up their start as an example, you can Google them and you will find that. And within that is the lesson, however, that God can use broken people to do God's will. Okay, God uses broken people all the time, and the fact that people have been called to do God's work does not mean that you are healed from the things that can still afflict you, that you're healed from the temptations and stuff of human sin. I mean, we see that in the Bible. David had been anointed by God. David became king. David still did what he did with Bathsheba and still arranged for Bathsheba's husband to be killed. Okay? So people called by God to do great things can be very flawed people. And people who are called by God to do great things, who do great things, sometimes still carry those flaws with them. And it's something we need to remember to separate. That being said, going back to the start of the church, what happened was they realized in the 70s that church attendance was declining. People just weren't going anymore. And they said, we don't just need a new church, we need a new kind of church. So they went door to door. The pastor had been a youth pastor. He had some 20-somethings following him, and he said, we're going to go door to door. And they went door to door, and they asked people, why don't you go to church anymore? And they got 3 main answers. Well, I don't go because I don't want to dress up. I don't want to get dressed up to go to church. And they said, well, if there was a church where you didn't have to dress up, would you go? Maybe. We don't like the music. The music's not relevant to us. We want to hear more contemporary, modern-sounding music. They said, well, if you had like a rock band, would you go? Some of them, yeah, maybe. The preaching is just not relevant. There's talking about abstract theology and not talking about subjects that are relevant to my life that will help me. Well, if the messages were geared toward your everyday life, would you go? And they just got all these people who said, yeah, you saw that. And so they said, okay, we're going to have a church where you don't dress up, where the music is contemporary, and where the preaching is relevant. And it's because of that church, it's because of Willow Creek that I'm standing here wearing blue jeans. Or not blue jeans. I forgot what color I was wearing, but I'm wearing jeans. I'm wearing jeans because of that church. But then, the next step in what they were doing was they needed a place to worship. So they got all these people who said they would be interested if they ever started, but they didn't have a place. So they said, well, we got to rent a place. But they didn't have the money. So they went to farmers outside of Chicago. Tomatoes. They went to tomato farmers and said, can we go into your fields? It's very biblical. Can we go into your fields and glean what the machinery missed? Because the machines don't harvest everything. We glean what they missed. And they went through those fields, and they picked them, and they had a roadside stand where they sold fresh, hand-picked tomatoes from a roadside stand, and they took the money to rent a movie theater to hold worship. And the first Sunday, they had 200 people in their service. And within 20 years, they were up to over 20,000 a weekend in their services. They had bought a 200-acre farm and all of this, and to this day, they have like a 7,000-seat auditorium and that they fill with multiple services, multiple campuses, all of that. But it created not just a new church, it created a new kind of church. Now think about what it would be like to sit there and say, to talk to those 20-somethings in a field and say, why are you picking tomatoes? We're going to change the direction of how Christians worship in the Western world. What? What? Picking a dozen of you picking tomatoes in a field, you're going to change the direction of how Christians worship in the Western world? Who knows if they thought that? Who knows if they knew? But somehow they had a vision that what they were working toward was to do more than just create another church in a country with 300,000 churches. They were going to create a new kind of church. They were going to create a church that didn't exist among those 300,000 other churches. And they started by going into a field and picking tomatoes. That's a vision. That's a worthy vision. And yes, a vision executed by people with some flaws. But then again, every vision is executed by people with flaws, because we're the ones God is using. But they did it. And so with that kind of thinking, hear what Jesus says. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed. Now, by the way, the background for this, of why the disciples were asking this question, was because in the intervening verses between the passage from last week and the passage from this week, there's a couple of verses where Jesus tells them that even if someone sins against you 7 times a day, you have to forgive them 7 times a day. And the disciples basically said, increase our faith. They're like, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. We don't have it in us to do that. We need to increase our faith in order for us to be able to do something that hard. And Jesus said, no, you don't seem to understand. You've already got enough faith. There is enough faith. If you have just this much faith, you can do amazing things. You can do things that are so much harder than just forgiving someone who sins against you 7 times a day, day after day, day after day. You can do it. It's not a matter of not having faith. You're underselling yourself. You're underselling yourself, Sometimes I think we forget that we need less than we think we need in order to accomplish more than we think we can. So often we stop ourselves. We say, I don't have enough to do what I want to do. And sometimes we scale down what we want to do. And we forget you need less than you think you need to accomplish more than you think you can. We overestimate what we need to get moving, and we underestimate what we are capable of. And Jesus is trying to remind us that no, that's not the case. But I think we do it because we want to avoid failure. See, I think what we do so much, I know I do it. I've done it so many times in my life. I've sat there and said, okay, I just want to set my goal, my bar. Sure, I'm gonna set a goal, a bar, a little bit beyond where I'm at, but I'm going to set it kind of modestly because I want to set a goal that I'm pretty sure I can achieve because I don't want to fail. because I don't like that feeling of failure. But then within the rest of this passage, what I think Jesus is doing is telling us what success or failure truly is. I mean, it's kind of interesting to me how he makes this strange segue into this story, this parable about slaves working in the field all day and coming home and serving the master, okay? You know, it seems like such an odd twist in the story to go from talking about the mustard seed to go and say, you know, what do you do? What do you do when you come home? When the slaves come back from the fields, do you expect me as the master to make dinner for you? Or would you serve me? He said, would you rather not say to that servant, prepare supper for me, put on your apron and serve me? Which sounds kind of harsh, right? It sounds, I mean, I listen to that and go, boy, I'm not really liking this master in this story. Sounds kind of mean. But then when you understand who he represents, he's saying, no, you need to remember that you do your job. And you're doing your job because in doing your job, you're serving God. In doing your job, you are serving God. And do you want me to serve you? Because the alternative to serving God is to believe that God should be serving you. The alternative to serving God is to believe that what you should be looking at in life is for things that serve yourself. And that's never going to be where an adequate vision is for your life. The adequate vision to look for in your life is never going to be about serving yourself. It is going to be about serving God, and if it is about serving God, it is going to be about serving others, because that is always what God wants us to do. And remember, meaningful accomplishment is never self-serving. I mean, think about it. I was racking my brain to see if I could come up with a counterexample in my own life to convince myself that this statement was wrong. But I have never in my life met a person who I perceived as being selfish, who I perceived as being about themselves, and who I thought was happy. Every single person in my life where I've met them and said, boy, that person thinks about themselves all the time. That person sets goals that's only about them. That person wants everybody around them to serve them. That person only thinks about how they are going to move their own life forward, and they never think about anybody else. I have never looked at such a person and thought, that is a happy person. Right? I always think there is something going on in that person that is deeply, deeply unhappy, deeply, deeply unfulfilled. Right? So when you think about that vision, that would be worth your life. It's not going to be about you, because I assure you that if you achieve a vision that is all about you, you will find that it is incredibly empty. You may achieve it, but you will feel empty on the inside. And there are so many people who are like that in the world. So many people who have achieved everything externally that looks like you would want to achieve, and inside they feel dead. Because what they achieved was about themselves. And it wasn't about others. And then when you do that, when you serve others, you know, the greatest satisfaction actually comes when you don't expect reward. All right? That's actually when the greatest satisfaction happens. I mean, the time you go home at the end of the day and you are bone tired and you're feeling good about what you've done. It's a day when you've served. And that was it. And that was the reward in and of itself. You didn't get a plaque. You didn't get named Volunteer of the Month. They didn't put your picture up on the wall. You just go home knowing that you did a good thing. And that's when you sleep well. So Jesus is telling them, look at what he says. He says, look, when you've done all you were ordered to do, say, we're worthless slaves. And I'll get to that word in a second because that sounds really bad in the translation. We have done only what we ought to have done. You know, we've done what we ought. We've done what God equipped us to do. And believe me, you will not surprise God. Okay? There is nobody in the world who has achieved great things, who has done wonderful things to advance the cause of peace in the world, to advance the cause of compassion. Nobody in the world has done amazing things that have helped humanity, that have helped God's cause, that have made God smile. No one has ever done that, and God said, wow, never thought they had it in them. You will not surprise God. God will simply look at you and say, I knew you could. I've always known you could. I created you with the ability to. I gifted you with the ability to. I'm happy that you discovered for yourself that you could do everything I knew you could do. You're not going to surprise God with what you accomplish. You can only say, I finally did what I ought to have done. I finally did what God created me to do. I finally lived into the potential God placed in me. And that's the definition of success, is to achieve that. And it doesn't make you worthless. That word worthless, it's an interesting word. By the way, that word, it only appears in the Bible in this one place. Literally, it means unworthy of praise. Of course, because you just did what you were created to do. All right? You did what you were able to do. All right? You didn't exceed expectations. You can't exceed God's expectations. You can just live up to them. You can do what God created you to do, and God knows you can do so much more. And so you're unworthy of praise. Now, there's an interesting commentary around this word, because it is so unusual that it only appears in the Bible this one time, that there's a little bit of potential wordplay. Some of the scholars have dissected the way this word is in the Greek, and they've said that you could actually look at this word and have it mean, I am debt-free. We are debt-free slaves. In other words, in doing everything we were supposed to do, we owe nothing more. And that's the way you can look at your relationship. In God creating you and gifting you and giving you the potential to do all these things, what you owe to the world is to be able to live into that. All right? Right? Think about it this way in other professions, right? If you're an incredibly gifted musician, you owe the world your music. If you're an incredibly gifted teacher, you owe children to teach them. If you're an incredibly gifted physician, you owe people the healing, right? When you're incredibly gifted, and I think each and every person alive is incredibly gifted. You were created with a gifting from God. Every single person is incredibly gifted. And in that giftedness, you owe the world the fruits of that giftedness. So if this word kind of means we're debt-free, it just means we've given to the world the fruits of our gifting. We've given the world everything we've been gifted to do. We no longer owe the world more. We've given it all. So what would it mean to accomplish what God knows you can? What would it mean to accomplish everything God knows you're able to accomplish? What's the dream you have? What's the dream you have to make the world better, a dream to impact others? How can you envision that? And then work backwards from that vision, step by step, to what you have now, to be able to build from what you have toward that vision. At the beginning of the series, we talked a little bit about the word happy, and we mentioned that word happy, that this word makarios in Greek is the word that would be translated as happy or translated as blessed. That it's the word that when you hear those phrases in the Bible where Jesus says, blessed are the poor, Blessed are those who mourn. Happy. It can be translated as happy. Happy are the poor. And that happiness is then tied to this feeling of blessedness. And there's nothing that would make us happier. Nothing that would make us happier than to be in touch with that feeling of having been blessed. And what we're blessed with is not the stuff that serves us. We're blessed with the ability to serve others. We're blessed with the ability to accomplish for God what God gifted us to do. When we're in touch with that, we will feel blessed. And we will reach the ends of our lives, or the ends and be able to look back and say, I did what I ought to have done. And that feels awesome. Amen.